I am a research and teaching fellow here at the university, and I research in all aspects of marine, molecular, and microbiology. So just to kickstart off the presentation, I know you had a few minutes to look at this. Does anybody have an idea what this sort of organism is? Indeed, if it is an organism. Does anybody have any idea? Yes, it's a coral. So a coral is actually not a plant, but it's actually an animal. As you can think, it's a colony of thousands of microscopic organisms which have grouped together to form a colony. So this is in fact a Gorgonian sea fan, which was first described in 1870 by a French naturalist who investigated a lot of the reefs around the North Pacific. So my presentation today will be about coral reefs. So the ecology and biology of coral reefs, and indeed threats to these, and why actually we need to preserve them. So the presentation outline will be as so. I'm going to talk to you a little bit in detail about what corals are, so the biology and the ecology of corals. I'll talk to you a little bit about the relationships of corals with their marine ecosystem, how they interact with their wider environment. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the important denizens of the reef. So previous to coming here, I was working in the Philippines, where I was a marine biologist, and I worked on the conservation of corals in the Coral Triangle. So as well as this, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how scientists who work out in the field actually identify coral. So coral are very difficult to identify because they have very similar forms, and there are thousands of species which are actually known to science. So how do we actually identify them? I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the value of corals, both to the wider environment and to us as human beings as a species. As well, I'll finish the presentation talking to you a little bit about the threats which corals face now on the planet. And if I have little time at the end, I'm going to give you a brief talk about this starfish here, which is a pretty mean-looking thing. This is called a crown of thorns starfish. Its scientific name is Acanthasta plantii, and I will go into a little bit of detail about how this starfish is affecting coral reefs around the world. So, what are corals? Corals are in fact animals. They're not rocks and they're not plants. They're actually colonies of tiny animals which are called polyps. So here in this photograph, we have a microscopic image of a coral colony, and we have one polyp here. So this is about 2 or 3 millimeters in diameter. And what these corals do is that they divide, they bud, and they form larger, huge masses of colonies. So what we have down here is an image of a colony of corals. So this orange color is a large colony of corals. As you can imagine, there's going to be thousands or indeed millions of these polyps which form these colonies here. Here on the right, we have another colony of corals, here in purple. So these colors are actually imparted by an algae which lives inside the coral skeleton. So corals are in fact invertebrates. So unlike you and me who have backbones, corals do not have backbones. There are actually two important kinds of corals which are actually known to science. These are the soft and the hard corals. So hard corals can be told apart from soft corals because they are hard, and they are hard because they exude and they're able to produce a calcium carbonate skeleton similar to the bones that we have in our body. So the soft corals do not produce these calcium carbonate skeletons because they do not have the enzymes, they do not have the biochemical machinery to produce these hard exoskeletons. So there are known to be about 6,000 species of coral which are currently known to science, and there are probably many more left to be discovered, as there are a number of corals which live in very deep waters and haven't actually been identified or discovered by marine biologists or scientists. So corals begin their life as planktonic larvae, similar to humans and many other species on Earth. There are female corals and there are male corals. So the male corals put out sperm and the female corals put out eggs. So at certain times of year, both the males and females exude these gametes, and these gametes then meet in the water column. These create, these fuse into new coral organisms. So over time, these corals then can float and they disperse via the ocean currents. And if they manage to settle in a new place which is favorable to life, so this might be shallow basins near to continental shelves, or indeed places where the water is not too hot or too cold or too acidic, and indeed a range of other environmental factors. So the corals then attach to hard surfaces. These are normally rocks or indeed other dead corals where they can start the formation of new colonies of corals. So the corals build their skeleton using this very simple biochemical reaction, which is a calcium mixed with carbon dioxide, and this creates calcium carbonate or indeed limestone. Lots of corals have a symbiotic relationship with an algae called zooxanthellae. And we can see in this picture here, these are the microscopic algae. I'll go into a little bit more detail about what these algae actually do, but these are probably several microns in length. So 1,000 of these could fit within one centimeter. So a lot of these algae actually provide nutrients to corals. They're algae, just like many plants in the terrestrial environment. They provide photosynthates via photosynthesis to their coral hosts. What corals do is they provide these algae with a home. So this is a basic polyp structure. So this is a very simplified structure. So what we have is just a gastrovascular cavity, which is what you can imagine just to be a stomach. So this stomach is surrounded by a ring of tentacles here, and these tentacles are actually filled with a large number of these zooxanthellae, as I talked about previously, so the algae. So these zooxanthellae carry out the process of photosynthesis and allow and impart sugar to the actively growing coral polyp. So the coral polyps, which are also very closely related to jellyfish, have these structures called nematocysts. These are like harpoons, which are spring-loaded. And what these harpoons do is when they come into contact with any sort of small marine organisms which might be floating in the marine environment, they may touch one of these tentacles, and what happens is this harpoon shoots out and it injects a poison or a venom into these prey species. So afterwards, the tentacles then grab these prey. So these could be like little fish, they could be little crustaceans, or indeed zooplankton. And then they then move the prey into the mouth, and then this gets moved into the stomach. So coral have this tissue here, which covers the whole surface of the colony, which is called the choanosarc. And the choanosarc is basically a tissue which allows the transfer of nutrients between polyps. So polyps, as I said, are tiny little animals, and they form together to create these sort of super dense colonies of polyps. So here we have, on this image, we have the corals here. You can see the polyps are now retracted inside their skeleton of their calcium carbonate skeletons. So here, the polyps are inside. The polyps retract at certain times of the day, perhaps in the daytime when there is too much light, or indeed when there are predators around. Here on the right-hand side, we have the polyps, which are actually outside. So the tentacles are outside, and they're actively catching prey or carrying out whatever process they might be doing. So how are coral reefs formed? Coral reefs are actually formed initially by the very small algae, which I mentioned, the zooxanthellae. So these are algae which are several microns in diameter. And what these zooxanthellae do is that they invade into coral polyps. So these coral polyps are then able to grow because they are given sugars by the zooxanthellae. Over time, you get the polyps that actually grow into large polyp colonies. So these might be several centimeters in length, and these all group together to form super colonies of polyps. So over time, these mature into larger colonies of polyps and indeed mature corals, until finally you get coral reefs. So I'm sure probably most of you here have heard of the superstructure, the coral reef, the Great Barrier Reef off the east coast of Australia. So this is actually made essentially by the zooxanthellae, which are mixed up with these coral polyps. So there are billions and billions and billions of organisms which make up this coral reef. So the Great Barrier Reef is known to be about 1,400 square kilometers, 1,400 miles in length, and it is double the size of the UK. So corals are known to inhabit most of the areas within the tropics. So all these red areas are actually zones, biodiversity hotspots. So these are areas where there is a lot of biodiversity, a lot of diversity of life. So for you students that are going to come here, these are terms that you're going to be learning throughout the course of your degree. So when I was working in the Philippines, the Philippines here is based in the Coral Reef Triangle. So this is one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. There are about 30 to 40% of all the corals which are actually known to science, which are concentrated in this area. There are also about 25 to 30% of all the fish species on Earth which are concentrated there. So very critical habitat for conservation. So when I was working out in the Philippines, I was able to do a lot of diving there, and I was studying a lot of the corals and indeed the denizens of the reef. And I'm going to give you a few examples of some of the animals I would have studied. So this animal is called a Nudibranch, and this is just a common slug. It's very related to the slugs that you might have in your garden. So this is a marine slug, and what they are called is a striped pajama nudibranch. And they gain these colors, these beautiful colors that they have through the consumption of the corals that they eat. So they go along and they use a radula, very similar to the snails that you might have in your garden. What they have here on the top of their head are things called rhinopores. So these are structures which allow the nudibranch to sense its outer environment. So what it does, they're olfactory systems, and they're able to sense maybe if there's a predator nearby or indeed if there's food. These structure in the back of it are the actual external gills. So this is how the nudibranch actually breathes. So its gills are on the outside, and this allows efficient dispersion, gas exchange, so the nudibranch is able to breathe. This looks like a rose. Does anybody have an idea what it is? No? So this is an egg casing of the nudibranch. So it looks like a marine rose, but actually this is composed of millions and millions of eggs of the nudibranch. And if you let this mature, you would have millions of nudibranchs which would come out of this at certain times of the year. It's absolutely beautiful. So this is a tunicate. This is a sea squirt. This is an organism which I found on one of the coral reefs in the Philippines, and it is called Polycarpa aurata. So it's called an ox heart ascidian. It looks like a heart, doesn't it? Especially with this venation pattern. So this is called a hemichordate. This is basically an organism which is the precursor of animals with a backbone. So this organism is very, very ancient, and it's over 250 million years old, so previous to the time of the dinosaurs. So what it has two siphons. So the top siphon pulls in water, and you can see inside there are sort of like hair-like structures. So what it does is that it captures these food particles inside the water, and then it expels them via this secondary siphon. This is called a Snowflake Moray eel. So there are lots of species of moray eels all around the world, and indeed these are related to the conger eels that we might have in British waters. One of the key important factors of the Snowflake Moray eel is the fact that it is one of the apex predators on coral reefs. So what it does is it accomplishes a very important role by feeding on and preying on diseased and weak fish. So it is a very good maintainer of biodiversity on a reef. One of the very interesting facts with these species is that it exudes a mucus all over its body, and this mucus is known to cement the reef in place. So it's very important that conservationists, marine biologists, and everybody kind of knows that the ecology of the reef is very, very important, and all the animals sort of like fit into place. They all accomplish different roles. So this animal is a crinoid. This animal is very, very ancient, and it is known to be over 500 million years old. So it is one of the first organisms, one of the first multicellular organisms to have evolved on Earth, and they're still here today. So what they have is this number of these feather-like structures, up to 20 or 30 of them, which come out, and they're very efficient feeders. They're filter feeders, and what they do is they just waft and wave in the breeze. In the sea current, sorry. And finally, this is another nudibranch. So there are over 14,000 species of nudibranchs on planet Earth, which are currently known. This species of nudibranch is called a blue dragon nudibranch. So it is very poisonous, and then you can see by the color that it has that it dissuades predators. So as well, the color is given off by a number of zooxanthellae, similar to the corals, what it takes inside its diet, inside its gut, through the consumption of corals, which are its natural source of food. So this is in fact a symbiotic relationship that this nudibranch has with the algae, similar to what the coral has with the zooxanthellae. So just to give you, I'm going to move on from this, just to give you a little idea about some other mutualistic relationships which we might be more aware of on planet Earth. So symbiosis. Symbiosis is whereby both species win. An example of these, of course, I know this is not the marine environment, but we can see that there are lots and lots of symbiotic relationships which happen on Earth, whether this be in the marine environment or in the terrestrial environment. So we have bumblebees in flowers, we have fungi and algae in lichen, and indeed we have your intestine and all the bacteria which live inside your gut. So you have a symbiotic relationship, and you need the bacteria in your gut in order to have a healthy life. As well as this, we have ants and aphids. So in this case, it's the ants which are protecting the aphids, and the aphids are imparting the honeydew or the sugars which come out of their rear ends. So compared to this, we have parasitism, which is where you have a relationship where you have one winner and one loser. So examples of this are tapeworms and intestines. So this is actually the intestine of a pig, I believe. The pig is losing out, and of course the worms are getting all the nutrition. As well as this, you have ticks and dogs, and indeed any number of warm-blooded animal. As well as this, you have mistletoe and trees. So we can see here the mistletoe is actually invaded the tree, and it's taking all the nutrients from the tree, and it's not giving anything back to the tree. So we'll go back to coral now. So you have a general idea of what parasitism and mutualism is. How do we classify coral? So one of the most accurate ways that we can classify any organism on Earth is using molecular biology techniques. So this is done using DNA sequencing. So this is a photograph of one of the instruments that we use here at the University of Reading. So this is a sequencer, DNA sequencer, and it allows us to read the genetic code of various organisms. So here we have some images of data, information which we might get back, which is going to allow us to identify a certain species. So we want to apply this to coral because coral are so diverse and there's so many different species of coral. This would be probably the best way of doing it. However, there is not enough information yet known about coral. There is a lot of species out there, but the database is not actually defined enough yet. So what we do at the moment, what most scientists do out in the field to identify coral is using their morphology, so how they look, what they look like. You look at something and you say, that looks like it's got big ears, it's got big eyes, it's some sort of animal. Yeah. So hard coral, we apply certain morphological traits to it. Hard corals are known because they exude this sort of compound made of calcium carbonate. So hard corals are from the order Hexacoralia, and Hexacoralia is because they have multiples of 6 tentacles, so they would have 6, 12, 18, 24. So if you wanted to know if a species of coral was a hard coral, you would count the numbers of tentacles it would have, and if it would have multiples of 6, it would be a hard coral. Soft corals, on the other hand, are known as Octocoralia, and they only have 8 tentacles. So it's a very good way of telling apart hard and soft corals. As well as this, I'm going to give you some very easy examples of how corals are actually identified. So does anyone have any idea what this coral might be called? Yeah? Brain coral. So very easy. Looks like a brain. It's homogeneous, generally boulder shaped, and it gives you a general idea of what a brain coral is. So it looks like a brain, that's why we'll call it a brain. Biologists are sometimes not very inventive. So this is a staghorn coral. So staghorn corals are very efficient growers. They grow very, very rapidly, and they have these primary, secondary, and tertiary branches. So these are very, very rapid growers. They could grow up to 25 centimeters per year. But the thing is, these corals are very prone to damage, and they are known to be affected by tidal currents, waves, and indeed damaged by boats and divers and snorkelers. So this is a table coral, and table corals are very good, and they grow very fast because they have a surface area, they have increased surface area which allows a lot of light to come down, and the zooxanthellae can then be very efficient at producing photosynthates. So this is a mushroom coral. So this is a single polyp. So these polyps are up to half a meter in diameter, and they actually are a single polyp. What they do is that they don't form, they're not very stable sort of corals, and they're able to float and flow within the currents of the ocean. So they don't give a very good sort of stability to the reef. So these are called flower corals or foliose corals. So they create these beautiful sort of swirl-like patterns, and these corals are very important to the reef because they supply lots of micro niches for inhabitants of the reef. So denizens, which I talked to you about before, nudibranchs, fish, eels, things like that. So these are columnar corals. These form pillars, so these are quite strong corals. The calcium carbonate skeleton inside them is very, very dense and very thick, and they supply a lot of micro niches for a lot of the organisms which live in the reef. And finally, we have crazy coral, or Corymbos coral. So these corals, we can't really classify them because they just have weird shapes. So it's flat here, it's got some out protrudings here. This one's got some weird morphology. So it's just very difficult to classify them. So why is coral so important? I'm going to move on to the next part of the presentation. So corals are important mainly because there are many countries, especially in the tropics, which share a border, a coastline, where corals actually are very present. So there are known to be about 1 billion people that rely directly on corals for their livelihood and their main source of protein. And it is also known by this paper written by Jennings and Ponulin in 1996, which showed that 1 square kilometer of coral is able to sustain over 300 people. Also, the World Bank did a study where they show that corals also supply up to $375 billion in ecosystem goods and services to the global economy. Corals are also very important because they provide coastal protection against wave action. So this is definitely the case in today's world where we're seeing a lot of changes in the climate and indeed tsunamis and extremes in weather. So what corals do is that they protect the headland, they protect the beaches by absorbing some of the energy that might be coming through these storms. As well as this, corals supply sand for the beaches. So corals are made of calcium carbonate, and over time these coral skeletons dissolve and degrade through the natural processes. As well as this, we have species of fish such as parrotfish, which actively chew on the corals, and they change the hard corals into sand. And this sand then ends up on the beach, which you, when you go on holiday, you enjoy by lying on. As well as this, corals also supply a lot of building materials, especially for countries in the tropics. Corals are also very important for many recreational purposes. You have a huge, massive tourist industry which revolves around scuba diving and snorkeling. So a lot of countries in the tropics rely on multi-billion-dollar industries where you have thousands and thousands of tourists that go scuba diving. And as well as this, corals supply live fish and corals for the aquarium trade. So this is probably not the best, but it's actually quite good in terms of conservation, especially in large national aquariums. So corals are also very important because they supply a large range of pharmaceutical compounds for medicine. They are known to have medicinal value, nutritional value, anti-cancer properties, as well as antimicrobial, antiviral properties. And they're also known to be very effective against possibly treating Alzheimer's and HIV. So corals have to be protected because they are a source of pharmaceutical compounds which scientists in the future may be able to discover. So threats to coral reef, I'm going on to the last part of my talk here. Many threats are, of course, man-made, and indeed there are a number of natural and/or environmental threats to coral reefs. So one of the main threats, of course, you might have heard, is global climate change, and this is promoting coral bleaching. So with global climate change, we have heating of the atmosphere, and we also have changes of temperature within the oceans. So corals are very, very sensitive to changes in the water temperature, and their symbiotic relationship with the algae is changed, transformed due to these changes in temperature. When the water temperature goes up, the zooxanthellae start to become parasitic on the corals, i.e. they're taking more than actually what they're giving. So what the corals do is get rid of the zooxanthellae, and this is why they bleach. So corals do not have their own color. As I said before, the zooxanthellae are the ones which are giving the corals their color. So corals are in fact just bones, skeletons. This is why they're white. Corals which are actually bleached are not actually dead, but the key problem here is that if you leave this for too long, the corals will actually die because they need the zooxanthellae within their cells to actually give them all the photosynthates. So associated with climate change is ocean acidification. So you have atmospheric carbon dioxide, and what this does, it dissolves into seawater, and this creates carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then dissolves and separates into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. So this makes the water more acidic. So this is very important in the reef ecosystem and indeed the marine ecosystem, because a lot of the organisms which live in the ocean require alkaline conditions in order to make their calcium carbonate skeletons. So we have all the corals, we have all the crustaceans, we have all the mollusks which need these sort of basic environments, alkaline environments, in order to make their skeletons. Of course, we have other threats, which are unsustainable overharvesting of reef organisms. So these include fish. Here we have mackerel in Chile, and indeed these are spiny lobster in Florida. So these are all key organisms in coral reef ecosystems. And if we're overharvesting them, then that is going to be affecting the reef as a whole. And indeed there is, of course, habitat destruction. So here we have on the left, we have something called otter trawling. So this is, we have a huge trawling vessel that would be pulling along a very heavy net behind it. And what this net has, it has these otter bars. So these are very, very heavy metal gates. In fact, they weigh hundreds of kilos. And what the ship does is it passes over a coral reef and it drags, it pulls everything with it and destroys everything in its path. It actually captures everything within inside its net. But the key problem is that corals take hundreds, even thousands of years to actually grow up to the levels they were before. So here in this picture, which I took in Philippines, a lot of the people there actually throw dynamite onto the coral, and this is actually done today, still today, every day. And what they do is they throw dynamite on the reef, and this completely obliterates the coral. So they're trying to catch the last remaining fish, and what they're actually doing is making everything worse for themselves. So as well as this, we have the nets, which get tangled in the coral. So these nets get covered in other algae, not the zooxanthellae, and this prevents the coral from breathing. As well, we have uncontrolled tourism activities. So here we have lots of divers who are probably, you shouldn't have that many people in one place, so this is causing a lot of havoc. And we have tourists here who are stepping onto coral and destroying very delicate ecosystems. And then we have this guy riding a turtle. Yeah, so this is not very good because the turtle is going to become stressed and it probably might not come back to that same place. As well, it's not all doom and gloom, sorry, but we have as well oil and mineral extraction. So the key problem here is that a lot of extraction takes up all this mud and sediment from the bed, and afterwards this sediment is then dispersed out into the wider ocean. And the key problem is that this sediment stays in solution for a long period of time. It doesn't go straight down to the seabed, and this actually clogs up the coral pores and the coral mouth, so they're not able to breathe. So finally, we're going on to the crown of thorns. So the crown of thorns is this very voracious starfish. So it can be up to about a square meter in diameter. Sorry, a square meter in diameter. And what it has about 20 to 25 arms. And these are equipped with all these very spiny barbs. And inside these barbs, they have certain numbers of proteins and toxins which make it which protect it from a lot of predators. So here is the bottom of one of these starfish, Acanthasta plantiae, and what they do is they move over the surface corals and they exude they push out their stomach, and in this stomach they have all the enzymes which helps the breakdown of the coral. So we have here the Acanthasta, and what it's done is it's breaking all the coral polyps underneath it, and it's killing them all. So the key problem is that these are actually natural predators of corals, so they're naturally in the environment. But the problem is that we are destroying and we are killing the predators of these crown of thorns. So this is another predator called the Triton Trumpet. So these are not very common anymore, essentially because tourists like to go on holiday and they like to buy shells. And these shells are very rare these days. But the key thing is to remember is that these Triton trumpets are the natural predator of the crown of thorns. And if you remove the natural predator, you get huge population explosions of the crown of thorns, and the crown of thorns are then going to be taking over the coral reefs. So these coral reefs are suffering a lot due to these outbreaks of crown of thorns, and they are known to eat over 10 square meters of coral a year. So that doesn't seem a lot, but when you have 1 million crown of thorns, That is definitely a lot. So the last bit of my talk is going to talk to you a little about marine conservation in action and what you scientists coming here to study, you could potentially contribute towards. And what I'm going to show you afterwards is how experiments in the laboratory can actually help to solve real-world problems. So the last is a video. It's about a 1-minute video that was made by the Australian Institute for Marine Sciences. And what they did was to conduct an experiment to see the effect of pheromones of Triton trumpets on the behavior of crown of thorns. So you'll see the video is split up into two parts. We have the crown of thorns, which is going to be moving in a little aquarium, and then afterwards you get the Triton trumpet, which is going to come over and consume it. It's quite a cool little video. And then afterwards, what we're going to have is the scientists have taken two tanks, and they put a crown of thorns into both of those tanks. Into one of the tanks, they just put seawater, and into another tank, they put seawater which has been amended with pheromones of the Triton trumpet. And you'll see that the crown of thorns, which in the aquarium into which the pheromones have been added, goes completely wild. So what the scientists wanted to do is try to develop a compound which is going to prevent crown of thorns from invading their reefs. Have a look at the video and you'll see, and that'll be the end of the talk.